Good morning to you all. And I'm sure you're all very happy to be with us here this morning and listening to Dr. Coulson. Well, you know, we Californians, we hang together. And it's my second opportunity to introduce Dr. Coulson during these sessions here. Dr. Coulson is a licensed psychologist, the director of the Research Council on Ethnopsychology, and a longtime consultant to the Georgetown University Medical School. He is a member of the editorial board of Fidelity magazine, edited by E. Michael Jones, a very excellent publication, dedicated mostly to the preservation of the family. He has also consulted on ethnopsychology for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and is presently a consultant for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention of the U.S. Justice Department. In the 1960s, Dr. Coulson was research associate to psychologist Carl Rogers, who was known as the guru of the non-directive therapy, and helped in that time Dr. Rogers create the country's first program of facilitator training. In the late 60s and early 70s, their ideas on psychotherapy swept the Western world. From 1968 to 1973, the two men co-edited a series of 17 volumes on humanistic education. At some point, Drs. Coulson and Rogers arrived at the shocking conclusion that they were really going in the wrong direction. But Dr. Rogers died before he could amend the errors that had been made. Dr. Coulson is now dedicating his life to trying to repair the damage by lecturing on the dangers of psychotherapy. He has appeared in numerous programs and written in many journals, among them the Today Show, Psychology Today, ABC's 2020, the Phil Donahue Show, and many others. He has spoken at a great number of these conventions in different parts of the world, and it seems everywhere I go, he goes too. And the saying goes that behind every great man there is a woman, and that wonderful wife, dedicated wife of his, Jeannie, is here too, because Dr. Coulson can't do it alone. He needs her too.
Thank you, Father Barnabas. The other day when he introduced Jeannie, he said, and his good wife is here, which sort of suggested there might be others, but this is the good wife, but this is the only one. On Thursday when I spoke, a young man asked a question about the Youth Offenders Act, which I understand is up for consideration for radical alteration in Canada, because you've got a big problem with growth of youth crime. And interestingly, yesterday's Globe and Mail had a report on page 3 about the fastest growing segment of the youth criminal population in your country is 12-year-olds. Not just in percentage of growth, but also to some extent in absolute numbers. It's a result of what Carl Rogers and his student Thomas Gordon, his most famous student, was this man Gordon. Jeannie, maybe look for that blue, the one with the blue toward the back there. It's got Gordon's quote on it. Tom Gordon was the creator of parent effectiveness training and teacher effectiveness training and leader effectiveness training and youth effectiveness training, all of which, make sure you get that other one back in the right place too. But go ahead. Oh, it was on top. Okay, sorry. Gordon took Rogers' ideas. Rogers was a teacher and tried to put them in popular terms for everyday application. The I message, which is so famous now. If you have taken a parenting course, you will learn about the I messages. And here Tom Gordon tells us that the greatest reward for parents who learn to send iMessages is that their children eventually take after them. And what this really means is no longer does anybody make a claim about reality, but only about their feelings. If you violate the law, I feel bad about it, and that's the best we can do for one another, is to say, I feel bad about it. That's Gordon's idea, which he got from Rogers. Gordon wrote a question in 1951 in Carl Rogers' book, Client-Centered Therapy. Gordon contributed a chapter to that book on group leadership, and the question was, how far can you take Rogers' permissive clinical methods into life? Into boardrooms, for example, or the workplace, or the family, or the church. He said, how far can you take clinical acceptance, understanding, and permissiveness? And I think the answer is evident by now. You can take it too far. And you can get 12-year-olds being the fastest growing segment of youth crime. Notice that Gordon says that if we tell our child honestly how we feel, it reveals to him our own humanness. What's the essence of humanness for the psychiatrist, the clinical social worker, or the clinical psychologist, or sometimes, sadly, for the pastoral counselor? The essence of humanness, your humanness, is to feel bad. The child learns you can be, says Gordon, hurt, tired, disappointed, harried, worried, and fearful. That's a list of human characteristics that only a clinician could love. There's nothing in there about confidence or good feeling or love or respect or any of the virtues. It's all bad stuff. Our kids, having been reared on the theory that the most honest thing that children can be given is bad stuff, don't want that much to do with us anymore. And they fall in with the peer group, which at least has confidence. So we've developed a way of teaching adults to apologize for what they know. When Janie stays out late at night past the curfew that she and her parents have agreed upon, a mother is no longer supposed to scold Janie. That's called a you message. You naughty child, you should come in on time. Rather, mother is now supposed to give what Gordon calls an I message. I worry about you, Janie, when you're out late. And somehow Gordon and the rest of us who did this kind of stuff didn't stop to think that the likely response on Janie's part, once she learned the routine, would be to say, Mama, don't worry. Mama, you worry too much. Mama, you need professional help with all your worries. Okay, Jean. Yeah, now the other. Well, anyway, we took this into the Catholic schools. That's the meaning of the title of my talk, Tearing Down the Catholic School System. It's not a recommendation. It's a report on what actually happened. And this magazine, The Latin Mass, did an interview with me last year, and my picture's on the cover, and which didn't make anybody in my home happy because they have to see too much of me as it is. But the headline says, Repentant Psychologist, How I Wrecked the IHM Nuns. The IHMs were the Sisters of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, who virtually ceased to exist after we were done with them. Well, I want to say how I wrecked the IHM nuns. I didn't do it by myself. I had considerable help. And in fact, I was more the helper than the instigator, though I have to bear my full share of responsibility for it. It was Carl Rogers' project. It was a project that on Thursday I suggested, Abe Maslow suggested we not try. He had destroyed the Jewish intelligence of Jewish students on the East Coast at the Jewish University and saw that we were setting out to destroy the Catholic intelligence of Catholic children on the West Coast with the same method. Don't do this, he said, but we went ahead and did it anymore and were filled with regrets. Before the end of his life, Carl Rogers, as I mentioned the other day and will mention again today, called the whole thing a pattern of failure. I heard one of our critics, one of HLI's critics on television on Thursday night in passing, in critiquing HLI, which it's obvious she doesn't know anything about, but in passing, in critiquing Human Life International, she referenced what she called the Latin Mass at the Basilica on Wednesday night. Now, I was there and you were there, and there was no Latin Mass there. This kind of indicates to me the quality of reporting that we get from the Catholic left as well as from the secular press. I wish I knew. There was some purpose she had in accusing us of having a Latin Mass, and I talked to her on the phone yesterday, and we didn't quite get that resolved. So I'm left with the question, what does it mean to the Catholic left, this symbol of Latin in the Church? And I think the answer is that they are in rebellion against their own heritage, their Catholic heritage, the Mass which for centuries was the only Mass. And if that's true, if that's the meaning of the Latin Mass as a symbol to the Catholic left, a symbol of our misguidedness, then it's trouble for us too, because this heritage which they despise also happens to be our heritage. The heritage that we want to leave with our children and grandchildren because we know how precious it is. We know how it's made us what we are. Catholics have the mind of the Church. There is no Catholic faith apart from the Catholic Church. I saw the star of the new noxious movie, The Priest, interviewed on television the other day. And the interviewer, Charlie Gibson of Good Morning America, asked him, did he not think that the movie was anti-Catholic? And he said, oh no, I love the Catholic faith. It's just the Catholic Church I can't stand. And I think, again, he doesn't know anything about the Catholic faith if he thinks you can have it independent of the Catholic Church. Where does he think it comes from, for heaven's sakes? Well, anyway, they want to get even, I think, with us, the Catholic left. They want to deny to our children and grandchildren what they haven't bothered to give their own. And because their own children now are deficient in knowledge of the faith, they want ours to be equally deficient. Then their own deficiencies won't stand out. Some of them haven't given it to their children, and some of them haven't bothered even to think about having children at all. Well, it's a rebellion then against one's own origins, and it's a common effect of what I've been calling in recent years TMP, too much psychology. A predictable effect of too much psychology instead of religion is this rebellion against our origins. Consider what happened at the Center for Feeling Therapy. I spoke about it the other day. This article appeared in 1988 in California magazine. It's getting a little weathered now, but the article was titled, When Therapists Drive Their Patients Crazy, and it reports that from the outside, on television and radio talk shows across the nation, the Center for Feeling Therapy looked like a promising new approach to psychotherapy, but from the inside, it was an object lesson in insanity. This insanity was ours. It was Carl Rogers' theory of psychotherapy for normal people. Those who were drawn to the Center for Feeling Therapy in Hollywood at considerable expense were not what we could identify as clinically psychotic, and many of them were not clinically neurotic. They were normal people who wanted to grow, as we said, who wanted to undergo what we called personal growth and develop their human potential, as we said. Let's look at the next one. This is what it eventuated to. All of the professional staff lost their licenses. For this reason, they had, among other things, sex in therapy. Well, not every one of them, but the major players in the Center for Feeling Therapy thought they could impregnate their female patients and then order them to kill their children, which they did 11 times over. Women who became pregnant at the Center for Feeling Therapy were forced to abort their babies. It made sense from the perspective of the theory that they were testing out there. If you have to become above all a self, if you have to get in touch with your imperial feelings, then how are you going to do it if you've got a child to worry about? A mother who's carrying a little one on her shoulder, who the little one wants to nurse now, will not be able to deal adequately with her own feelings about her personal development. Her focus will run quite naturally. That's the mother's gift to the child. So kill the child. That was the theory. Those who brought themselves into therapy already being mothers were forced to give their children up to others so that their therapy wouldn't be interfered with. And those who carried them under the heart, the little babies, the precious feet, 11 times over they were forced to kill them. So the state of California, interestingly enough, got exercised about this and put out a booklet now that comes with every new license to become a therapist in California. The booklet, with their own underlining, is professional therapy never includes sex. You can't do that. It's what we call the California absolute. It's the only absolute we follow in California, but it's a start. Well, the other one is you can't drive on the wrong side of the interstate highway. Okay. So here's what happened. I'll review what I said the other day. You can turn that off, Jeannie, for a minute. Just leave that one up and turn it off. In May 1973, the state of California charged against the staff of the Center for Feeling Therapy. Therapist X told Melody G that she was crazy, and in September 73, he required her as part of her therapy to go to her father's grave and tell her dead father that he had made her crazy. In February 1974, the same therapist required Melody G to humiliate her mother as part of her therapy as a way of asserting her independence. Guess what? Her mother killed herself in December of 1974. The humiliation worked. Here's another charge against the Center for Feeling Therapy. These come from the Attorney General of the state of California. During approximately 1974 through 1980, therapist Y aided and abetted the religious abuse of Michael S., who was constantly ridiculed for his Jewishness, and on one occasion was required to go to an Orthodox synagogue to see, quote, how dead the people are, unquote. On one occasion, therapist X had a group of patients encircle Michael S. to point at him and shout at him, Jew, Jew, Jew. It's to get him over his particularity and to move him over into the realm of personhood, as we called it, as though a person is a kind of pure spirit, an angel, if you will, with no heritage whatsoever. That's the program for the destruction of not only Catholic schools, but Jewish schools. But it wasn't just Jews that they were after at the Center for Feeling Therapy, but anybody with a heritage at all, anybody with a long-time story, and with hope, therefore, to keep the story going and make it even better in the next generation. That's the common hope across human history, a better life in the next generation. In 1976, as this story of horror at the Center for Feeling Therapy was developing, Carl Rogers spoke at the summer facilitator training program that we were then doing at the University of California campus in La Jolla, California. He spoke about the effects of this system, which he had not yet agreed was too much. It wasn't his term, too much psychology. He was then calling it the person-centered approach. He spoke of its effect on various institutions. His system of psychology had first been called non-directive counseling, then client-centered psychotherapy, and finally, as I said, the person-centered approach. It had started out as something sober and scientific. This is from the Scientific American, November 1952, an article by Carl Rogers indicating how serious the question behind the research was. He was not frivolous by any means. During the past dozen years, he wrote, a growing group of psychotherapists have been developing a new approach called client-centered therapy. From the outset, we sought to bring a rigorous and objective point of view into psychotherapy. We wish to apply to our work the methods of psychology and the behavioral sciences. And that is why we are soberly aware of our responsibility to test and retest each aspect of our thinking, to perfect increasingly rigorous methods, to make each study available for proof or disproof by workers in our own and other fields. This is a noble calling. It's the calling of the scientist, but it's not going to be doable if you don't produce yet another generation of scientific apprentices who are capable of thinking rigorously and who, far from becoming intoxicated in encounter groups, are willing to be sober. Keep that word intoxication and the word sober in mind. Because here's what happened next. As Rogers said in 1966 in a tape-recorded interview with the head of the Center for Feeling Therapy, as a matter of fact, I've learned, he said, all kinds of things from graduate students. In fact, I think most of my more significant ideas have come from younger people who did very little with the ideas themselves. Tom Gordon would be the exception, I think. Frequently, these were people whose thinking was not very clear-cut. Often they were screwballs. That's his term. I was the chief screwball there for a while. Folks, so these screwballs got involved, the younger people. By and large, not yet fully formed. Don't turn the next one on, Jeannie. Just set it up there. Yeah. The radical revolutionary quality of the enthusiasm of the screwball crew is suggested in the report of a young Jesuit, one of those that we got involved with in the mid-'60s. He had been just about to be ordained when he signed up for a 5-day encounter workshop with Rogers and myself and others from the staff from the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute. This is what he wrote to us afterward about the meaning of his transformative experience in the workshop. Quote, "It seemed," he said, "like a beautiful birth to a new existence. It was as if so many of the things that I had valued in word were now becoming true for me in fact. It is extremely difficult," he said, "to describe the experience. I had not known how unaware I was of my deepest feelings, nor how valuable my feelings might be to other people. Only when I began to express what was rising somewhere deep within the center of me, and saw the tears in the eyes of the other group members because I was saying something so true for them too, only then did I begin really to feel that I was deeply a part of the human race." He was in his late 20s or early 30s, having grown up in a good Catholic home, and only now did he feel like a part of the human race. There was some kind of alien conception of what it means to be human that he had been suddenly introduced to in that 5 days of encounter. He wrote, "Never in my life before that group experience had I experienced me so intently." Oh, that was the problem. His parents had not introduced him to the experience of me, but rather to the experience of God and the service of God and God's people. And then he wrote, "To have that me so confirmed and loved by the group, who by this time were sensitive and reacting to my phoniness. It was like receiving a gift," he said, "that I could never repay." Well, he hustled himself. He got ordained and then hustled himself out of the priesthood in order to begin doing these groups for other people so that he could, as he said, repay their tears. But what about this phoniness that he mentions? What is his phoniness? Well, his phoniness is, among other things, his Catholic faith, the doctrine. Because if in an encounter group or a New Age retreat you look inside yourself and you find, for example, the creed, you can imagine someone in the group being alert enough to say to you, "Well, you're just being a mama's boy. All that Holy Mother Church stuff, isn't that it? You're just doing what you were taught to do, when I want to hear from the real person. I want to hear from the me within you, the child within," as it is sometimes said. And so doctrine gets set aside as a kind of accident to be overcome. From the proof of authenticity then on this workshop model, unfortunately a Catholic workshop model in many parts of my country, I suppose yours too, the proof of authenticity is to go against what you were trained to be. To call all of that training at your mother's knee a kind of phoniness, and to say instead what is deepest within you. Unfortunately, what's deepest within you includes certain unrequited longings, among them sexual longings. What happened is we provoked the crisis that today is misidentified as the pedophilia crisis in the Catholic Church. In this hemisphere, it's not a pedophilia crisis, it's a crisis of bad philosophy, too many workshop experiences, too much searching within for what we haven't yet expressed, and finding that after all, the sexual feelings have been pretty reserved until now. Let's unreserve them. That's what we provoked. This misconduct went back to a research question. Rogers wrote the question in a journal titled The Psychiatric Research Reports. The question that we had come to California from the Wisconsin Psychiatric Institute to study beginning in 1964 was, Rogers wrote, quote, "whether psychotherapy can be made available to the person who has no conception of psychotherapy and no conscious desire for psychotherapy." In other words, the question was, what would happen if you gave counseling or psychotherapy to people who didn't want counseling or psychotherapy and didn't know that they needed counseling or psychotherapy, not in any recognized scientific sense? What would happen? The answer in the case of the young, just about to be ordained Jesuit was a partial answer. As he said, he got spiritually intoxicated. We did workshops thereafter for a number of years with a number of Jesuit seminaries, theologates and universities, as well as other orders like the Franciscan Friars of California, the Mercy Sisters, the Sisters of Providence of Charity, the Holy Cross Fathers, on and on and on. Rasa Gastaitis, a young journalist of Catholic background, whom I'll mention again later, visited Alma College, the Jesuit theologate on the West Coast, after we had been there to do a workshop. And this is what she wrote about the college post-Rogers. Quote, Alma College near Los Gatos, California is one of the 2 top Jesuit training centers in the United States. Its students, who have lived a decade or longer under the tutelage of the Society of Jesus, are used to rigid discipline with much formality and severe restrictions on personal emotional life. A year ago, last spring, that is February 1967, Dr. Carl Rogers and 9 of his associates from the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute, a small think tank in La Jolla, California, came to Alma to conduct a weekend of encounter groups. Nearly the entire community of Jesuits, more than 300, voluntarily took part in these meetings, which were designed to encourage people to react freely to one another. Since then, she writes, life at Alma has changed. In the dining room, where faculty, students, and lay brothers used to sit all at separate tables, all now eat together. In some classrooms where dry lectures had been customary, small groups now engage in lively discussion. One professor scrapped the notes for an entire course soon after the weekend and asked his students to draw up personal study plans. A few students left the order for civil life, then more students later. One who was inspired by the workshop to explore himself and the world beyond sanctioned boundaries was dismissed. The Alma upheaval, she concludes, is not atypical of what happens to groups and institutions that come in contact with the mild-mannered, soft-spoken Dr. Carl Rogers. When Alma closed, as it did, the Jesuit remnant, who were now considerably diminished in size, moved across San Francisco Bay to be near the California campus, University of California campus in Berkeley, where Jesuit studies on the West Coast continue today. Last night we heard, Jeannie and I, of a local priest who had gone off to Berkeley to meditate for a year, and now he's back. And Jeannie said, what was the effect of Berkeley on him? And we were told, well, now he does dream analysis. I suppose he does enneagrams too, though I didn't hear about that. In 1969, a WBSI team repeated the Alma experiment in a theologate on the East Coast. A letter from a faculty member there indicates a typical Jesuit concern in that era, and it's what led to the workshop. This faculty member wrote to us, quote, I want something to happen inside my students. I really want to be more than a brilliant lecturer. Consequently, I have a very strong feeling of having been somewhat a failure as a teacher. I have tried to break down the image of the teacher and to create the image of an equal, searching out problems just like my students. In the past, I have tried everything I know to reach through to them, from vulgarity to almost promiscuity, to try to free them enough to be able to respond freely in the classroom or in small group discussions. But I have not felt any honest, lively response coming back from them, he wrote. So an Alma-type workshop was arranged for the entire seminary. Afterward, what the faculty member tried in his theology class was to talk to the students about himself, about what he said were certain homosexual fears, as he called it, that he had had. Having done this, he wrote to us and said that he felt deeply embarrassed by the outcome, as though I had gotten caught with my hand in the cookie jar. It didn't work. So he asked us for help, and we sent a small team to conduct a workshop just for his theology class. And this time, in the small workshop, when he talked about his homosexual fears in front of his students, he said he felt more comfortable. Where does the pedophilia crisis come from? I think I know. For this work of ours, and similar work in other Jesuit settings, in a sense for reducing morality to comfort, Carl Rogers, our team leader, was granted honorary doctorates in the 1970s by 2 Jesuit universities. If I have not managed to indicate it before now, I want to say that the problems of American Catholic schools have not been caused by Carl Rogers, the person, who is a very decent person, a very sober person. But unfortunately, Carl Rogers, the person, died in 1987, having called the experiment for what it was, a pattern of failure, and nobody knows about that. And it seems to be impossible to call the experiment off. It continues apace in parish schools in my country. To my eye, signs of the effects of this experiment turn up fairly frequently in news reports these days of lawsuits or arrests, if you will. A summer camp director, Catholic summer camp, for example, in Jeannie's in my home county of Mendocino in California, has been charged with the sexual abuse of teenage boys. A report in the Santa Rosa Press-Democrat, February 4th, 1994, has it that the director, who sadly is a priest, denies any wrongdoing. Interviewed by the press, he said, quote, "I'm very much at peace with myself. I don't have a sense that I'm burdened by this whole event that has arisen," unquote. What does that mean? It means if I'm not troubled by it, it must mean that I didn't do anything wrong. You remember Father Richard Chung, who committed suicide having been accused of a similar offense at a Catholic high school in Colorado, and who told the principal before going out the next day and gassing himself to death in the automobile in his garage, who told the principal, "But I haven't done anything wrong." In other words, I don't find myself feeling burdened by any of this. What catches the psychologist's eye is the doubly self-referential quality of this priest's second sentence. He says, "I don't have any sense that I'm burdened." In the spring of last year, in her press conference in the East Room of the White House, Mrs. Hillary Clinton, I mentioned this the other day, was asked about her behavior in the Whitewater real estate and the commodities trading cases, and this was her answer. Quote, "I am extremely comfortable and confident about everything that I have done. So how dare you to question me?" And she's right, of course, if our morality is nothing but how we feel about ourselves and our intentions and our behavior, and if we've been divorced from our heritage. The problem with all such claims to be comfortable with bad behavior is the subjectivity of it. In 1964, Rogers made a famous film on psychotherapy. He and Fritz Perls and Albert Ellis all interviewed the same young woman on an afternoon in Santa Ana, California, the Gloria films. I see some of you nodding as though you've seen these training films. Gloria said to Dr. Rogers in the course of that demonstration therapy session, quote, "I want you, Dr. Rogers, to help me get rid of my guilt feelings." She was recently divorced, a mother of 3. She was sleeping around, working as a waitress at night and bringing men home after the kids were in bed to sleep with them and then hustle them out in the morning so the kids wouldn't be scandalized. And she felt bad about not sharing this with her children, not letting the children know their mother openly. That was what she felt bad about. She felt guilty. She said, "Dr. Rogers, I want you to help me get rid of my guilt feelings. If I can get rid of my guilt feelings about lying to my children or going to bed with men, any of that, just so I can feel more comfortable." Well, Rogers had recently arrived from the Midwest, from Wisconsin, and he hadn't heard the likes of this before. This is what he finally brought himself to say, though he had to break character to do it because it wasn't very non-directive. He said, "Let me see if I understand. What you'd like to do is to feel more accepting toward yourself when you do things that you feel are wrong? Is that it?" And she said, "Yes," with a big smile. And he says, "It sounds like a pretty tough assignment. How do you do wrong and feel right? How do you be bad and feel good? How can it be that you're false and can feel true or want to? Don't you know that your conscience makes you feel guilty for a reason?" he might have said, the Midwesterner still. At the time we called this young woman's kind of self-assignment of wanting to feel comfortable no matter what she does, we called it California morality, and we disdained it as such. But since then, it's spread across the North American continent, including throughout Canada, as I have seen. A summer Catholic camp director who adopts California morality might miss the fact that, quote, I don't have a sense that I'm burdened, is not literally responsive to questions about the rightness of his fondling teenage boys down by the swimming hole. His response, I don't have a sense that I'm burdened, could mean merely that he's lowered or over-personalized his standards of morality. An irregular sort of autonomy might be suggested. Father mentioned that I'm a consultant, or was a consultant, to the U.S. Federal Bureau of Prisons, and let me tell you, I met a lot of autonomous men in prison. That's how they got there. Well, it's developments like the subjectivizing of morality that led Carl Rogers to call the whole Rogerian movement in education a pattern of failure. I mentioned on Thursday that he revised Freedom to Learn after the pattern emerged. The second edition of Freedom to Learn was published in 1983, and it had a 25-page section added to it by Rogers, a section entitled A Pattern of Failure. But then he died, and after his death, his editors went to work on producing a third edition of Freedom to Learn. You can't buy the second edition anymore. You can only buy the third edition, which came out last year, with the 25 pages missing. The Pattern of Failure has been vaporized. It's gone. It's a book for teachers in training, including teachers training to be Catholic parochial school teachers. They will not know that this experiment was a gross failure. You can look all day, you can search all night, and you won't find the Pattern of Failure section any longer in Freedom to Learn. In advance of this postmortem development, as if anticipating this postmortem development, Carl Rogers swore in a tape-recorded session with a group of us in La Jolla in 1976, he told about a bad reaction he'd had to the whole movement the previous summer. He had been in an encounter session that summer in a workshop that he did with his daughter, Natalie. And, we have Carl here? That's all right, Jeannie. This is Carl Rogers' Freedom to Learn. I forgot I'd stuck that one in there. Let's do the next one. Yeah. He had been in a small encounter group, and he had to flee the thing. This was his feeling. I left that group thinking, well, I started this damn thing, and look where it's taking us. I don't know where it's taking me. I don't have any idea what's going to happen next. Well, what happened next is that some of his younger screwball colleagues persuaded him to cheat on his wife, or at least to try, as a proof of his own personhood. She was ill, seriously ill, the last 7 years of her life. And during that period, there were people who worked on Carl Rogers thinking that they were expressing his own philosophy, who said, how can you be your own person if you're attending so often to her? Reading on down there a little bit, I started this thing, or had a real part in starting the whole idea that led to the workshop and so on, and now look where it's carrying us. Where is it going to carry us? And did I start something that is in some fundamental way mistaken, and that may lead us off into paths that we will regret? Carl Rogers, 1976, commenting on his realization of the previous summer. And the answer to his question, did I mislead people, is yes. I'll say it again. There was an epidemic of sexual misconduct that was provoked. Interestingly, a 1939 book by Hilaire Belloc, the great English-French philosopher, Catholic philosopher, and literate man, this book was about Charles II, Charles Stuart of England, and it really does explain how it works that when you cast off doctrine and upbringing, what arises is inevitably sexual in character. If there are no more limits, then we have to have some kind of absolute, and the absolute of our appetites is always there, ready to be released. This excerpt from the book The Last Rally about Charles Stuart appeared in The Wanderer just a couple of weeks ago in the From the Mail feature. I want to set up, however, the Belloc quote with a quote from Martin Buber, the great Jewish theologian and philosopher who had such a good influence on people like Abe Maslow and Viktor Frankl, who did not fall in line finally with the sexual revolution. And this is Janie Buber's up there, if you could turn it on. This is to set up Balak's comment about religion and sexuality. Religions are mansions in which the spirit of man is fit, in order that it might not break forth and burst open its world. Each religion has its origin in a particular revelation and its goal in the overcoming of all particularity. Each religion reserves the universality of its mystery for those who live in it. Therefore, to compare one religion with another, valuing and devaluing, is always an undertaking contrary to being and sense. If there is a universality to the Catholic mystery that our children might grasp, they have to first live in it. They have to live in a Catholic home, which means an articulately Catholic home, not a feeling-centered Catholic home, lest their spirits break forth and burst open their worlds. Well, this is what Hilaire Belloc said, anticipating, as it were, the sex problem stirred up by the idea of bringing therapy for normals into Catholic seminaries and parochial schools. Quote, there is one side of a man's life which is today grotesquely exaggerated, he wrote in 1939, and that is sex. It is exaggerated through the loss of that which both explains and regulates human life, namely religion. The chief mark of our age, he wrote, is the eclipse of religion, that is, of one fixed and consecrated philosophy which shall make a man understand his own nature, provide moral sanctions for his acts, and see his various functions in their right proportion. In the absence of such a flywheel, our machinery races. Emotion masters reason, and appetite comes to occupy the mind. Since sex is, with men, a strong, recurrent, and permanent motive, a society lacking religion will give sex far too important a place. And I think we saw that on Wednesday night, did we not, in the riot outside the Basilica. Rogers was asked on tape in 1976 about the effect of his idea of universal psychotherapy, which after all was more of a question than a commitment, at least when he began. What was the effect, for instance, on institutions, he was asked. And he answered with respect to religion, interestingly enough, particularly the Catholic religion. This is what he said, asked about his effect on institutions. Quote, it has been thoroughly insidious in religion. I don't know what to say about that. The Roman Catholic Church, he said, is a strictly hierarchical organization. Other churches vary from that in greater or lesser degree. I could write a lot of interesting anecdotes, he said, about people who started quiet revolutions in their churches or in their own lives. Carl Rogers, 1976. Tragically, one of those who started such a revolution in her own life was his daughter, Natalie, the mother of three. She had never been a church member. Carl and Helen Rogers had broken away from the church when he was in seminary at Union Theological Seminary in New York City in the 1920s, the most liberal of the Protestant seminaries. He didn't want to be a church minister anymore, didn't even want to be a church goer, and his children were not raised that way. But Natalie did have a family, as many people do, when she got involved with her father's theories and the theories of Abe Maslow on self-actualization before Maslow saw the damage that they did. Among the damage that Maslow saw was the damage to Carl Rogers' only daughter. In 1980, Natalie wrote a book titled Emerging Woman, A Decade of Midlife Transitions, what she called her self-empowerment. For instance, this episode was recounted in the book Emerging Woman. Quote, I can't believe this is me, she had written in her diary in the summer of 1968 and quoted in her book. I can't believe this is me, that I did it. I have actually pulled out of our house and away from my children. Will I ever have breakfast with them again, she wrote. As I write this, I sob. I feel totally cut off from who and what I am, the mother, the wife, the housekeeper, the party planner, birthday party giver, counselor to children, and husband. It doesn't make sense. She left home to become a person when she said what she really was all these things she was leaving. One of those who also wrote about the effect of the Rogerian Revolution in his own life was Father James J. Kavanaugh. You will remember him, some of you, as the author of A Modern Priest. Looks at his outdated church. Carl Rogers was a friend of Jim Kavanaugh's and might have said more about his story as it developed, except that it worked out badly for Kavanaugh, and Rogers was reluctant to report negative experiences of individuals or to embarrass them. As you can imagine, he was especially reluctant to discuss cases that were close to him, cases like Natalie's, but then she took care of it for him by writing a tell-all book about herself in 1980. There were good times and bad in Natalie's 1980 report. She wrote of looking at the photographic record of the early years of her marriage to Larry Fuchs. The photos represented the good times. This is what she wrote. When I look at our photo album, I see pictures of a loving honeymoon. In Europe with our tiny English car, I see hikes and picnics with the kids, birthday celebrations and travels, the warmth in our faces, radiance and laughter in the children together. As many hours of as many days as possible, we were together. We shared our lives focusing on the world and the children. Bedtime stories, Saturday walks, family art projects on Sundays. Together we built a nest, a home out of which each of us could fly only to return to its safety and warmth. But that was how it was before she got involved with TMP, too much psychology. Afterward, there were the bad times. She said that upon leaving home in the summer of 1968, as she went searching for an apartment, she said, quote, I noticed that prospective landlords look critical at me, like, can you pay your bills, madam? Are you, madam, abandoning your children? Father Kavanaugh himself abandoned his church and became a psychologist. He had earlier written an article under a pseudonym, Father Nash, in Saturday Evening Post, in I think it was 1966, titled, I am a Catholic priest, I want to marry. After he left the priesthood and the church, a few years later, he could have written another article with the following title, I am a former priest, I want to marry and divorce again, and then I want to lose my license to practice psychology, because that's exactly what happened. He married, divorced, became a psychologist, and then had sex with one of his patients in therapy, admitted it to the California Medical Board, and lost his license. He can't do any longer any of what he was trained to do, all in the name of what Natalie called self-empowerment, what the young Jesuit called me. Jamie Kavanaugh told me once on the phone that he and Carl Rogers used to get together and laugh about which of them had led more people out of the Catholic Church, himself or Carl Rogers. This may or may not be an accurate report. Carl was dead by then and I couldn't check it with him, but neither man could possibly have laughed about what happened to Natalie when she left home. Concerning the effect of all of this on the church discipline deteriorated under the workshop regimen. Civil and public health problems also developed nationally. The fact is that out of the church and away from home are not the only places where followers and research subjects of the theory of too much psychology were led. To jail was another place. Not only the fellow I mentioned to you on Thursday, but a couple of Franciscans that we worked with in California who later went to jail. One of them killed himself recently upon release from prison. Disease was another place they were led. One of the young Immaculate Heart nuns that we worked with reported on her experience in a 1984 book under the title Lesbian Nuns, Breaking Silence. broke our heart. She'd gotten, quote-unquote, liberated in her group workshop with us in 1966. Later, she also got 2 sexually transmitted diseases. Liberation from her profession, her vows, had liberated her from good health as well, as it often will. Joe Blow is the name I'm going to give to the guy I mentioned the other day who wrote a book for us in the Studies of the Person series. He later wrote a couple more books, and Carl Rogers wrote the foreword to one of those books that he wrote in 1974. This is what Rogers wrote in the foreword to this man's book, in anticipation, I suppose, of him going to jail. Quote, "For me, it is an awesome experience," Rogers wrote, "to discover that I have unwittingly been a profound influence in the life of another. It is disturbing to discover that my way of living and being," he didn't really mean his way, he meant Natalie's way by then, "which is satisfying to me," it wasn't, it troubled him, "has deeply affected the behavior of another person. Does this man realize," he said, "what he's getting into?" Well, what he got into was jail. This is what he told the judge before he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Quote, "My career is ruined. My profession as a psychologist is ruined." He had traveled up and down Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, finding that he was unsatisfied sexually and unsatisfied as a businessman, and became a businessman involved in the sex business, a professional pimp, after hours from his Department of Education job in the capital of the United States of America. So there was a lot of pain that developed, but the pain finally fit into the theory of TMP2. The idea of TMP, too much psychology, is that tears conduce to personal growth. Pain is said to be good. Journey into Self was a documentary film that won the Academy Award for short documentaries for the year 1968. It documented an encounter group with Carl Rogers as facilitator, a film that was produced at the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute in the mid-60s. This is what a woman in the group, a housewife, said about the meaning of life that she'd found in that weekend encounter group. Quote, "I think it's so wonderful that we could all sit here together and feel each other's problems and cry with one another. It's something I've never had in a home," she said. "That's the truth a la TMP. The idea is that the fullness of the person is realized in tears. The more of them, the better, and have there ever been a lot." The woman who made this comment about crying, if you've seen the film, you can still rent it, is named Beth. Carl Rogers commented about experiences like Beth's. He said, quote, "It seems to me that perhaps group experience tends to weaken a person's institutional ties. I think you see this in colleges where students who have been through groups tend to join free universities or self-directed courses which are outside the organizational structure. And I can't help but wonder what that's going to do to our institutions," he said. He was concerned about the effect on all institutions. He thought that its effect on religious institutions, particularly the Catholic, was particularly insidious, as I said. But it remained for him an experiment. No one really knew how it was going to turn out, didn't know it was going to turn out so badly, didn't know it was going to threaten the very survival of our civilization in the Western world. But it does, it has, it will. Group work, like Carl Rogers and I did with the Immaculate Heart nuns, weakens institutions. That's clear now. But what takes their place? What takes the place of institutions? It looks like, eventually, it's unremitting pain. That's what kept turning up. Carl Rogers facilitated for 35 years before he died. This is what he wrote about the group process in 1981. Quote, he wrote it, interestingly enough, in a 1981 paper called Communities. You know, we have a lot of writing among religious orders in the Catholic Church about the sense of community. This is what Carl Rogers said the sense of community had devolved to in our experience with nuns and priests and seminarians. As this working process goes more deeply, it can bring great personal pain and distress. Nearly always the pain has to do with insights into self or with the fright caused by a change in the self-concept or distress over changing relationships. So there are experiences of frustration, distrust, anger, envy, and despair in the group. In the individual, there are the personal experiences of suffering through change, of being unable to cope with ambiguity, of fear and loneliness and self-depreciation. But both the group and the individual experience these sufferings as part of a process in which they are involved, in which they somehow trust, even if they could, at the moment, give no rational reason for doing so. So we've got all these people now involved in something that isn't rational. The people who are doing it can't even figure out why they're doing it, but they continue to do it. And having done it to themselves, they want to do it to your kids and to our grandkids. Rogers' interest in group work of this kind emerged from his question that I gave you before, whether psychotherapy can be made available to people who have no conception of it and no conscious desire for it. We experimented on that in Wisconsin, and the experiments there suggested the answer was no, it can't be given to them. But then we moved to California, and we continued to experiment, and we learned that maybe it could be given to them, but that it wouldn't have a good effect. It would be, at the least, a risk. Carl Rogers said this about the Immaculate Heart Project as it was beginning. He said, whether we recognize it or not, we're experimenting with helping people to develop in ways that have never been part of the main cultural stream. That is to be more open, think about these terms, more open, more non-defensive, more expressive of feelings. What has CCD become? What has religious education become? An exercise in openness, non-defensiveness, and expressiveness of feelings. Rogers said, listen, we're engaged in a new cultural enterprise which places value on behaving very differently in social groups than individuals have customarily behaved. And do we know for certain that that's a better way to behave? He said, well, we think so, but we don't know so. And so we're involved in a risk, and so are the other people, he said. Let me see if I can just touch on the Immaculate Heart Project for a moment before we stop. Jeannie, I'm probably going to jump ahead to the picture of Mother Regina, okay? The Immaculate Heart schools in Los Angeles were taken as an example in a number of secular journals as an example of the flowering of American higher education. Well, I'll tell you what happened to this flower, folks. It died. There is no more Immaculate Heart College. It was a very progressive Catholic women's college in Los Angeles. It closed in 1980. It never could recover from all the feelings that we introduced into the school. This is what they looked like before we got a hold of them. I don't know if you can see it, but there are a couple of dozen happy young women down there with Mother Regina, who later became the Mother General of the order. There are only a few gray heads left. They're like all the other Leadership Conference of Women Religious orders now. They're dying. But they were happy and progressive and looking forward to a good life together when we got a hold of them. Then Sister Mary Benjamin got her sexually transmitted diseases, having been seduced after one of our encounter sessions. This appeared in the newspaper at Immaculate Heart College about our work. This ran us out. We had gotten resistance from the senior faculty. They immediately recognized that what we were doing was dangerous, and they recognized it because they were Catholics. They thought with the mind of the church. The youngsters had been brought up Catholic too, and finally the youngsters wrote in the newspaper in plain language, WBSI is using the Immaculate Heart College complex as a guinea pig. This conjures up visions of mad scientists performing hair-raising experiments on unsuspecting victims. Unfortunately, the actual explanation of WBSI's reason for being here conjures up even wilder visions. Simply mention the term sensitivity session, for example, and watch the reaction of people who consider themselves relatively secure. So the kids asked us to leave, and to the credit, Jeannie, you can turn that off, of Carl Rogers, we did that. We took off. One problem at Immaculate Heart was the transformation of classroom climate. The college had been the nuns' flagship school. It ceased to exist. A mother, when pulling her daughter out of Immaculate Heart College, said, listen, she can lose her faith for free at the state college. What went wrong, we can call it the emptying of heads, and the overflowing of hearts is illustrated in the case of a professor of literature at the college who attended one of our faculty workshops. She wrote to us afterward to say, quote, "My classroom behavior is radically different now. I have been able to confess anxiety to my classes and consequently to feel more comfortable in the classroom than ever before. I have invited the girls to call me by my first name, and after a couple of weeks they are doing so. This allows for a lot of freedom. I am not giving grades any longer, and I'm not even giving exams. They are writing their own questions, the ones that are meaningful to them, and then they are discussing them." One of her students wrote to us, interestingly enough, about that class. She said, "Listen," she said, "there is a human pushing now in that class all the time. Sometimes I come out of that class and I feel like I really want to cry." And then the college closed. Finally, it was the replacement of academic substance and the endemic Catholic tradition of restraint that brought the whole project and the college down. There were simply too many feelings. The students had become the subject matter. Understanding that they were being disabled, they joined with the faculty elders to petition for relief. We left Hollywood, returned to La Jolla, wounded. The college expired. In the words of one of the faculty elders, we had facilitated the action there had we ever. In every school that we worked with, the same result occurred. That was what Rogers called the pattern of failure. The failure, again, was with respect to what was an experiment, but I don't know, it's been virtually impossible to call the experiment off in Catholic schools. Remember the question that Natalie Rogers said she imagined prospective landlords were putting to her as she looked for an apartment? The question was, are you abandoning your children? Are you abandoning your children? Well, yes. By now there are a great many abandoned children, even if many of them appear still to live at home. But the home doesn't contain them any longer. It doesn't have walls. There are no restraints, no more interest in containment, only acceptance, understanding, and permissiveness, only the expression of feelings. Some of these children who are neglected live in poverty, materially, of course, but others are found in homes which were sufficiently affluent to have afforded trips to the encounter workshops for the parents and to the other centers where self-fascination was taught in the 1960s. But it's not over. It didn't stop with the end of the 1960s. It's going on today in seminaries and in parish schools. We have to put a stop to it. I can't think that there's a better group to take care of that than you. Thank you very much.